Emma stood at the kitchen window, transfixed by the gentle ballet of raindrops as they etched delicate trails across the glass. Outside, the world was muted by the drizzle, yet inside every sound, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the clock, echoed her solitude. In her trembling hands, a cup of freshly brewed coffee radiated warmth that failed to reach the chill deep within her. Every sip reminded her of promises made and now broken. Only hours before, her life had been an intricate tapestry woven with shared dreams and quiet laughter. But that morning, the remnants of their shattered union lingered in every corner of the small apartment. Emma's thoughts drifted back to the final anguished argument with Leo. His words still rang in her ears. "You don't get it, Emma. It's not just us. It's everything." His grip on the back of the chair had been so desperate, his knuckles white with a force that belied the underlying exhaustion and fear. In that moment, every hope they'd nurtured seemed to crumble. Leo had walked out without a backward glance. In his wake, a series of harsh realities descended like winter's chill. The rent notice arrived with a stark finality, followed by bank statements confirming that their joint account was frozen, an immediate and unforgiving severance from their shared life. The papers, scattered on the table, bore witness to a future now abruptly uncertain. Heartbreak, Emma realized, was not patient. It arrived with bills and notices, with the crushing weight of everyday life turning love into a burden too heavy to bear. Yet it wasn't only the financial ruins that pained her. As the morning wore on, an inexplicable nausea began to rise, as if her body were mirroring the inner turmoil she refused to acknowledge. Every small movement, every sip of coffee, became a reminder of the disintegration of what she once knew. Memories of Leo's gentle laughter and quiet reassurances clashed violently with the harsh echoes of his parting words. The apartment, once a sanctuary filled with shared hopes, had transformed into a mausoleum of memories. The faded photographs on the mantel, the trinkets on the shelves, and even the faded curtains now whispered stories of a life that had slipped away. The rhythmic patter of the rain outside provided a melancholic counterpoint to the stillness inside, each drop a note in a sorrowful symphony that underscored her isolation. In the midst of this desolation, however, Emma's heart, though bruised, still flickered with a stubborn ember of resilience. That tiny spark was a reminder that even in the depth of loss, one could find the will to rebuild. As she gazed through the rain-streaked window, Emma silently vowed that this break, the moment when everything seemed to collapse, would also mark the beginning of a new chapter. It was a painful turning point, a place where grief met determination. In that fragile moment, the endless drizzle seemed to murmur a promise, that even the darkest night yields to the dawn. The bitter taste of the coffee, mixed with the salt of her tears, was a potent reminder that sometimes endings are as inevitable as the rain. And yet, even as the physical manifestations of her loss, financial ruin, emotional void, settled in, Emma clung to the hope that out of this devastation, something unexpected might bloom. It was the uncertainty of tomorrow that both terrified and beckoned her. With a final steadying breath, she set the cup down and turned away from the window, silently acknowledging that the breaking point was not an end but a prelude to change. The days following Leo's departure bled into one another in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. Each morning, Emma awoke to the relentless churn of nausea, a physical reminder that her body was quietly heralding a new reality. At first, she blamed the overwhelming stress, the constant pressure of bills, and the weight of loneliness. But one morning, as sunlight timidly peeked through the drawn curtains, she discovered a small plastic stick on the bathroom counter. Two unmistakable pink lines stared back at her, clear and unyielding. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Emma's knees buckled as if surrendering to the gravity of her new truth. Clutching the cold porcelain of the sink, she felt as though the very ground beneath her was shifting, tilting her world on its axis. The baby, so fragile and yet so defiant, was growing inside her, a living testament to both love and loss. The realization was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Over the following days, the duality of her existence became painfully clear. By day, she navigated the ceaseless demands of her work as a waitress, moving among clattering dishes and hurried orders. Every moment behind the counter was a struggle to keep up appearances, to hide the tremors of uncertainty that threatened to expose her inner despair. In the quiet corners of the restaurant, where the chatter dimmed and the clinking of cutlery softened, Emma allowed herself to acknowledge the miracle burgeoning within her. Each tiny kick felt like a silent promise, a reminder that life, no matter how marred by sorrow, carried on. Yet nights were the hardest. Alone in the cold apartment that now felt less like a home and more like a cell, Emma's mind would race with memories of Leo, his voice, his smile, the warmth of his embrace, and then crash into the stark reality of abandonment. She longed for answers, for some form of solace in the midst of a storm that threatened to drown her. With every pang of nausea, every cramp that reminded her of the growing life inside, Emma's resolve was tested. But even as despair nibbled at the edges of her determination, she clung fiercely to the hope that she was capable of forging a new path. Her uniform, once a symbol of professional pride, now hung loosely over a belly that was both a source of joy and a reminder of her solitary struggle. The fabric stretched to accommodate the burgeoning life within, a constant, physical reminder of what she must protect. Every kick from the tiny life inside resonated like a drumbeat of determination. "We've got this." It was a mantra whispered in the quiet hours before dawn, a private vow that despite the cruelty of fate, she would rise again. In the solitude of those long nights, when the apartment silence was broken only by the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet, Emma allowed herself moments of vulnerability. She recalled the dreams of a future once shared with Leo, the plans for a family, the promises of a happy home, and felt the bitter sting of their abrupt end. Yet, even as memories of what could have been haunted her, the life growing inside her demanded a fierce kind of hope. It was as if the baby's every movement declared that endings, no matter how painful, were merely the precursors to new beginnings. Slowly, Emma began to understand that her unexpected condition was not a curse, but a challenge, a call to redefine herself beyond the confines of past relationships and shattered dreams. In that bittersweet revelation lay the seeds of transformation. With each passing day, she grew stronger, more resolute in her determination to face the future head-on. The pain of her isolation was gradually replaced by a tentative optimism, one nurtured by the silent strength of a tiny heartbeat. As she lay in bed at night, listening to the soft thump of her own pulse intermingled with that of her unborn child, Emma whispered promises into the darkness. Promises of perseverance, of courage, and above all of a future where love might be found anew, even if it meant finding it within herself. The unexpected life growing inside her was not just a burden to bear, but a beacon of hope that, no matter how desolate the present, tomorrow could still hold the promise of light. The restaurant buzzed with its usual evening energy, a chaotic symphony of clattering dishes, animated conversations, and the sizzling of pans. Emma moved through the space with practiced precision, though every step felt weighted by the personal struggles she carried. Behind her crisp uniform and practiced smile lay a storm of emotions. Tonight, as always, the restaurant was both her stage and her sanctuary, a place where she could momentarily lose herself in the rhythm of work. As the dinner rush commenced, Emma balanced trays laden with plates of garlic-infused pasta and perfectly seared cuts of meat. The aromas mingled in the air, a fragrant reminder of life's simpler pleasures, even as her mind churned with memories and regrets. Each table she served became a fleeting tableau of her former happiness, a couple laughing over shared secrets, a family enjoying a rare evening out, the quiet solitude of a diner lost in thought. Amid the clamor, an impatient voice cut through the cacophony. "It's about time. We ordered sparkling, not still." The words were sharp and devoid of any semblance of gratitude. Emma's grip on the tray tightened, the plates trembling slightly as if echoing the turmoil inside her. "I'll fix that," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the ambient din of the restaurant. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if the man at the table, absorbed in the glow of his phone screen, ever noticed the subtle sadness in her eyes. In the midst of her work, the whispers of judgment from nearby diners stung like icy rain. Comments floated through the air, snatches of idle gossip, assumptions about her unkempt hair, her tired eyes, and the way she seemed to carry a burden that was not her own. But each time as she passed a reflective surface, a mirror behind the counter or the dark window of a side room, she would lean in close and murmur softly to the small life within her, "I promise I'll make this work." The vow was both a comfort and a challenge, an unspoken pact between mother and child. The hours passed in a blur of orders and brief moments of solitude between courses. Despite the chaos, Emma's thoughts drifted to the past, memories of shared meals with Leo when everything had seemed possible, when every plate of food and every shared glance carried the promise of a future together. Now, every order and every morsel served was a reminder of a life that had been abruptly interrupted. In one corner of the restaurant, as Emma delivered a refill of water to a table of regulars, she caught sight of her own reflection in a window. The tired lines etched into her face, the stubborn glimmer in her eyes despite the exhaustion, reminded her that she was more than the sum of her heartbreak. With each tray balanced and each order fulfilled, Emma was rewriting her story, one plate, one whispered promise at a time. Yet even as she forced herself to focus on the immediate tasks, the weight of her reality pressed in. The restaurant, with its vibrant energy, was also a mirror to her own internal chaos. The sizzling of meat on the grill and the clatter of cutlery served as a stark counterpoint to the silence that awaited her at home, a silence punctuated by the lonely thump of her heart and the steady, reassuring rhythm of a tiny life growing stronger with every passing minute. As the dinner rush began to wane and the last orders were called in, Emma allowed herself a brief moment to pause. Leaning against the cool surface of a countertop, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, summoning the courage to face another night. The restaurant might be filled with the laughter of strangers and the hum of conversation, but within her, the journey towards self-redemption had only just begun. Each shift was a battleground where hope fought against despair, and as Emma wiped her hands on her stained apron, she silently vowed that no matter how hard the night became, she would persevere. The December wind howled outside as the restaurant's heavy door chimed open, drawing Emma's attention from the flurry of clearing tables. She was in the midst of a quiet moment, a brief respite between orders, when a pair of voices, warm and unmistakable, sliced through her haze. It was as if the very air around her shifted when she heard it, a gentle yet commanding tone that she recognized all too well. Emma glanced up slowly, her eyes widening in disbelief. Through the glass partition of the dining area, she saw a couple enter, their laughter light and their presence magnetic. For an instant, the restaurant's clamor faded into a distant murmur as she fixed her gaze on the man. He moved with a measured grace, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the hostess's smile. "Two, please." "Near the window if you have it," he said, his voice calm yet carrying an undercurrent of authority. The tray in Emma's hands wobbled precariously as if in protest. The familiar timbre of his voice sent a jolt through her, a mixture of shock, anger, and a lingering, unhealed ache. Leo. He was here, in the very place where she sought refuge from the ghosts of their past. For a heartbeat, time seemed to suspend every detail, the soft glow of candlelight on a table, the murmur of distant conversations, receding until only the present moment remained. Her pulse pounded in her ears as panic clawed at her chest. Emma's mind raced with memories of their final, painful confrontation and the bitter taste of abandonment that had followed. How could fate be so cruel as to thrust him into her new world, a world she was desperately trying to rebuild from shattered fragments? In that charged moment, her hands tightened around the tray, her body instinctively recoiling as if trying to erase the sight. Yet, even as the shock threatened to immobilize her, the practical demands of her job surged forward. A distant call from her manager, "Emma, table 7. Cut through her reverie, pulling her back to the present. Reluctantly, she tore her gaze away from the figure at the door, feeling as though her very soul had been laid bare by the unexpected encounter. In the brief seconds that followed, as she resumed her duties and moved toward table 7, Emma's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The encounter with Leo was a collision of past and present, a reminder of a love that had once promised everything and ultimately left her to pick up the pieces. Each step felt heavy, burdened not only by the weight of her responsibilities, but also by the haunting presence of a man who had once been her world. As she approached the table, every movement was measured and careful. The laughter at the newly occupied table, the clinking of glasses, and even the muted chatter around her seemed to fade, leaving only the echo of her own heartbeat and the unspoken question. What did fate have in store now that their paths had crossed once more? The restaurant, with its familiar din and transient lives, had become a stage for this long-overdue confrontation, one that would force Emma to confront not only the remnants of her past but also the uncertain promise of a future yet unwritten. In that split second when the past and present collided, Emma's world spun out of control. As she navigated the narrow aisle between tables, her body betrayed her. The tray she clutched trembled as if possessed by a force beyond her control. "Tenet happenet, a sudden misstep." The tray slipped from her grasp, and time seemed to slow as plates flew into the air. The sound of shattering glass rang out like a knell. In an instant, the restaurant fell into a stunned silence, all eyes turning toward the commotion. Emma's heart pounded furiously as she watched the cascade of fragments scatter across the polished floor. For a long moment she was frozen, her mind a whirlwind of regret and fear, until a sharp voice broke through her paralysis. "Is everything okay?" it demanded, and she barely had time to register the concern in the tone before a hand reached out to steady her. It was Leo's hand. In that brief contact, every suppressed emotion surged forth: guilt, sorrow, anger, and the painful vulnerability of two souls laid bare. "Emma," he said, his voice soft yet laden with meaning. The sound of her name on his lips sent tremors through her, stirring memories of a time when the world had made sense. Her eyes darted up to meet his, searching for some flicker of the man she had once known, yet finding only an expression marred by shock and regret. In that charged moment, the collision was not just physical, it was the raw convergence of every unspoken word, every unshed tear, and every lost dream. The chaos of shattered glass and hushed whispers around them blurred into insignificance as their eyes locked, each silently demanding an explanation for the impossibility of this encounter. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Emma's fingers still clutched the edge of the tray, the sting of its betrayal mingling with the ache in her chest. Finally, with a voice that trembled between defiance and despair, she whispered, "Just a waitress." Her words were a shield, a way to diminish the weight of their shared history, to reduce herself to the role the world had forced upon her. "And you?" came his quiet reply, laden with a bitterness that mirrored her own. "Justa kovat." In that exchange, every hurt, every broken promise, seemed to pulse in the silence between them. Leo's expression faltered, a brief flash of guilt softening the harsh lines of his face, but before he could offer any further words, Emma turned on her heel and walked away without looking back. The collision had been inevitable, a fateful encounter where two lives, once intertwined, were forced to confront the enormity of what had been lost. As Emma retreated into the anonymity of the busy restaurant, her heart ached with 1,000 unspoken questions. Each step away from him felt like a step away from the past, yet the echoes of that moment would linger long after the shards of glass were swept away. Later that evening, as the restaurant's lights dimmed and the buzz of conversation subsided, Emma found herself alone in a quiet corner of the dining area. The brief encounter with Leo had ignited a firestorm of emotions she had long tried to suppress. Now confronted by the raw evidence of their shared past, the spilled glass, the unspoken accusations, she could no longer pretend that the wounds were healing on their own. The silence was broken by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Emma's heart lurched as she saw Leo emerging from the shadows, his face etched with a mixture of regret and determination. "Emma," he began tentatively, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the restaurant's late-night cleanup. His eyes pleaded for understanding, for a chance to explain, but she raised a trembling hand to cut him off. "Just a waitress," she repeated, her voice cold and firm, a line drawn in the dim light. "And you?" she countered, locking eyes with him. The air between them crackled with tension as Leo's features contorted, a silent admission of his own failures. "Just a coward," he murmured, the words heavy with the burden of a past filled with mistakes. His admission was not an excuse, it was a confession of the deep-seated fear that had driven him away from everything they once held dear. For a long moment, they stood there, two wounded souls in a space that had once been the center of their shared world. Emma's fists clenched at her sides as she struggled to contain the torrent of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger, sorrow, and betrayal warred within her, each vying for dominance in the charged silence. Leo, too, appeared small and contrite, his eyes reflecting the remorse of a man who had lost more than he could ever hope to regain. Yet even as her heart screamed for retribution, Emma felt a resolute strength emerging from the depths of her despair. "I won't be defined by this," she whispered, more to herself than to him, as if in that solitary moment she were reclaiming the fragments of her identity that Leo's departure had shattered. The confrontation was not about forgiveness, at least, not yet. It was about acknowledging the raw pain that lay between them, an unspoken understanding that both had been scarred by the choices they'd made. Without waiting for another word, Emma turned away, her steps resolute as she exited the small circle of light that had briefly contained them. Leo's gaze followed her, desperate and filled with a longing for redemption that went unspoken. As she disappeared into the night, the confrontation hung in the air like a fragile promise, a promise that someday perhaps the wounds might begin to heal. Outside, the December air was crisp and unforgiving as Emma stepped onto the dimly lit street. Her breath materialized in small clouds before her, each exhalation a silent testament to the cold reality of the night. The confrontation with Leo had left her feeling both exposed and resolute, and as she walked briskly along the empty sidewalk, the memories of that charged encounter played on a loop in her mind. The world around her was hushed, the only sounds the crunch of her footsteps on the frost-covered pavement and the distant hum of traffic. Yet, even in the stillness, she could sense another presence following, an echo of the past that would not let her simply fade away. "Emma, wait!" a voice called out from behind, tentative and laced with urgency. She paused, her heart pounding as she turned slowly. There, a few paces behind her, stood Leo. His eyes were filled with a desperate vulnerability that made her blood run cold. "I didn't know," he pleaded, his words tumbling out in a rush as if trying to bridge the gap between regret and redemption. Emma's expression hardened, the chill in the air mirroring the frost that had settled over her wounded heart. "You would have stayed?" she challenged, her tone sharp as ice. The question cut through the night, laden with all the bitterness of lost hope. "Don't lie, Leo. You didn't leave because you didn't know. You left because you didn't care." Her voice, though trembling with emotion, carried a firm finality, a line drawn in the snow that he could not cross. For a moment, Leo's face crumpled, the anguish of his choices and the realization of the pain he'd inflicted washing over him in silent waves. But even as the tension between them reached its peak, the frigid air seemed to wrap around them both, a reminder that some wounds, however deep, could only begin to heal with time. Emma's eyes shone with tears that reflected not just sorrow, but also a fierce determination to protect the future that lay within her. "Maybe I was a coward," Leo admitted softly, his voice barely audible over the whisper of the wind. The admission was both a confession and a plea, a silent hope that in acknowledging his shortcomings, perhaps there might be a chance for understanding. Yet Emma's resolve did not waver. With a final look that held both sorrow and steely determination, she turned away, her footsteps resuming their steady rhythm as she moved into the night, leaving behind the ghost of what once was. The cold night swallowed her figure as she disappeared down the empty street, each step a declaration of independence from the past that had tried to reclaim her. In that moment, amid the frozen silence and the lingering echoes of a painful goodbye, Emma embraced the solitude that would accompany her forward journey, alone yet unbowed, ready to forge a new path in a world that had once seemed so full of promises now shattered by betrayal. In the quiet hours before dawn, Emma found herself alone in the darkness of her small apartment. The events of the evening, the shattering collision, the raw confrontation, the bitter words exchanged on a cold night, played repeatedly in her mind. Each memory was a weight, pulling her back into a past she had desperately tried to escape. In the stillness of that long night, she sat on the edge of her unmade bed and allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her loss and the heaviness of her regrets. Every creak of the old floorboards, every distant sound from the city beyond her window, became a reminder of the life that once was and the future that now seemed so uncertain. Emma's thoughts were a tangled mess of recollections, the soft laughter that once filled their evenings, the tender moments of shared silence, and the inevitable disintegration that had followed when Leo's fears overcame him. In the fragile darkness, she realized that the past was not something easily left behind. It was an indelible part of her, etched into every heartbeat and every whispered hope. Yet, amid the despair, there were sparks of defiant resilience. With each quiet kick from the tiny life growing inside her, Emma felt a gentle insistence that she must rise above the pain. The baby's soft movements were a silent promise, a reminder that even in the midst of heartbreak, there was a future worth fighting for. In that solitary hour, she vowed to carry the weight of the past not as a burden, but as a lesson, an integral part of the journey toward rediscovering her own strength. The room around her, cluttered with remnants of a shared life, a faded photograph here, a worn-out scarf there, seemed to whisper secrets of what had been and what could still be. Emma's mind wandered to the promises she had made to herself during moments of quiet desperation, that she would not let bitterness rule her days, that she would seek hope even in the darkest corners of her soul. The weight of the past, though heavy, was now a catalyst for transformation, a necessary pain that would one day give birth to a renewed self. In the deep silence of the early morning, as the first tentative light began to seep through the curtains, Emma made a choice. She would no longer allow the ghost of what might have been to dictate her every move. With a final determined exhale, she gathered the fragments of her scattered hopes and whispered into the darkness, "We don't need him." It was a quiet declaration, a promise to herself and to the life growing within, that the future would be shaped by her own will, not by the echoes of a past marred by betrayal. Outside, the city was stirring, oblivious to the personal battles fought in the quiet solitude of one small apartment. But inside, as the night yielded to the gentle caress of dawn, Emma felt the first fragile rays of hope seep into the cold corners of her heart. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, yet in that sacred moment, the weight of the past began to feel less like a chain and more like the foundation upon which she would build a new beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of monitors replaced the familiar cacophony of the restaurant as Emma awoke in a hospital room that felt both alien and intimately familiar. Every detail, the crisp white sheets, the soft hum of machinery, the cool touch of metal, served as a reminder that life, in its unpredictable cruelty, had ushered her into another phase of this tumultuous journey. Emma's eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the clinical light that bathed the room. For a moment, panic surged through her, fueled by the disorienting blend of physical pain and emotional uncertainty. But then, amidst the sterile environment, She felt it, a reassuring flutter deep within her. The unmistakable heartbeat of new life, soft yet insistent, reminded her that even in the midst of crisis, there was a promise of hope. A gentle knock at the door broke the fragile silence, and Emma, still trying to make sense of her surroundings, turned as footsteps approached. The door opened quietly, and there he was, Leo, standing hesitantly in the doorway. His eyes, dark with remorse and uncertainty, swept over her with an unspoken question. "I heard," he murmured softly, his voice tentative as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. "I had to know you were okay." For a heartbeat, time seemed to suspend as Emma regarded him, this man who had once been her everything and had now become a ghost from her shattered past. The soft beeping of the monitor, the steady rhythm of life that still pulsed within her, provided an unexpected counterpoint to the storm of emotion swirling between them. Despite the pain and betrayal, there was a glimmer of regret in his eyes, a silent admission of the part he played in her suffering. The hospital room, with its cool, impersonal light, became the stage for a confrontation that was as raw as it was necessary. Emma's voice, though hoarse from disuse, trembled with a mixture of anger and wounded hope. "Why are you here?" she demanded, the question hanging heavily in the air. Leo hesitated, his eyes searching hers for some semblance of forgiveness. I couldn't just disappear again," he stammered, his admission barely audible over the steady beeping of the machines. "I know I can't fix what's broken, but I need to be here." His words, simple and unadorned, carried a weight of regret that seemed to fill the room. As Emma absorbed his confession, a myriad of emotions warred within her. The bitter taste of past betrayals mingled with the realization that life's unpredictability had forced them together once more, in a place where vulnerability was laid bare. The hospital, cold and clinical, had become the unlikely crucible for their tentative reconciliation, a space where the pain of the past met the uncertain promise of a future yet to be written. Before Emma could muster a reply, another sound intruded, the soft rustle of a nurse's footsteps, the distant murmur of conversations beyond the sterile walls. For a fleeting moment, the world beyond the room reminded them that life was continuing, indifferent to their personal dramas. And yet, in that quiet interlude, as Leo's eyes met hers with a plea for understanding, Emma found herself wavering between anger and an inexplicable longing for closure. In that hospital room, as the monitors continued their relentless, comforting beat, Emma realized that the journey toward healing was just beginning. The pain of yesterday, though unyielding, was now mingled with a fragile hope, one that whispered of second chances and the possibility of transformation. And as the day broke outside the window, painting the sky in hues of gentle gold, Emma silently resolved that this moment, however painful, would be the first step toward reclaiming her future. The tension in the hospital room lingered long after Leo's unexpected arrival. In the quiet aftermath of their brief reunion, the space between them was filled with unspoken words and the raw vulnerability of two souls at a crossroads. Emma's gaze, steeled by a mix of indignation and the fierce desire to protect the fragile life within her, met Leo's uncertain eyes as she struggled to find the right words. "Why?" she demanded, her tone brittle with emotion. Was it all just to feel better about leaving? The question was not so much an accusation as it was an appeal for clarity, a desperate need to understand why the man who had once been her safe harbor had vanished when she needed him most. For a long, heavy moment, Leo said nothing. Then, with a quiet crack in his voice, he offered the only explanation he could muster. "I know I can't fix this, but I need to be here." His eyes, dark with regret, searched hers as if pleading for a sliver of forgiveness. When he added, almost as an afterthought, "I paid the hospital bills," the admission rang out as both a confession and a feeble attempt to atone for past wrongs. Fury flared within Emma, a burning mixture of betrayal and sorrow. "You can't buy your way back," she shot back, her words echoing in the sterile air as she struggled to reconcile the man before her with the coward who had left without explanation. Yet even as anger pulsed through her, Emma recognized a truth that cut deeper than any rebuke. Healing was a process, one that required more than apologies or monetary gestures. With each measured breath, she fought the overwhelming tide of emotions, the desire to lash out and the equally powerful impulse to understand. The hospital room, with its relentless beep of monitors and quiet hum of activity outside the door, bore silent witness to the first fragile steps toward reconciliation. In the lingering silence that followed, Leo shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping as he acknowledged the pain etched into every line of Emma's face. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the soft whir of the air conditioner. "But I'm here now. I want to be, if you'll let me." The words, simple and raw, carried the weight of every regret, every missed chance at redemption. Emma's eyes flickered with conflicted emotion as she considered his plea. The road ahead was uncertain, paved with the debris of broken promises and shattered dreams. Yet for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she sensed a possibility, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected encounter might be the beginning of a slow and painful healing process. With a deep, steadying breath, she replied, "The first step is admitting that we're both wounded. But I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I need time to figure out if we can ever rebuild what's been lost." As the conversation dwindled into a heavy silence, the air between them shifted imperceptibly. In that quiet space, amid the hum of hospital machinery and the soft rhythmic beat of life itself, Emma began to see a glimmer of possibility. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but if there was one undeniable truth, it was that change was inevitable. And so, as the early morning light filtered through the window, painting the room in gentle hues of hope, Emma resolved to take that uncertain first step, one small step toward healing, toward understanding, and perhaps toward a future where the scars of the past might one day transform into the foundations of something new. In the days that followed the tense confrontation at the hospital, a tentative bridge began to form between Emma and Leo, a bridge built not on grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but on small acts of presence and quiet understanding. Leo, determined to prove that he was more than the coward who had once fled, made his way back into Emma's daily life, arriving unannounced at the hospital with simple offerings: a warm meal, a kind word, a silent vow to remain by her side when she needed it most. Evenings became a quiet ritual. As the sky darkened outside and the world outside the hospital quieted into a soft lullaby of night, Leo would sit by Emma's bedside, sharing the modest dinner he had prepared. His presence was unassuming yet persistent, a silent testimony that he was willing to remain, even in the face of Emma's lingering resentment. "I don't want my child to grow up thinking that running away is what we do when things get hard," he confessed one night, his voice raw with regret and hope. The words hung in the air, mingling with the soft beeps of medical monitors and the gentle rustling of hospital linens. Emma listened, her guarded heart wavering between bitterness and a desperate longing for stability. Each meal, each shared moment of silence, was a quiet step toward rebuilding trust. Leo's eyes, once so full of unspoken excuses, now held an honest vulnerability. He did not promise miracles or claim that everything could be mended overnight. Instead, he offered steady companionship, a willingness to be present through the long, painful process of healing. Slowly, the long nights spent in isolation began to yield to moments of unexpected warmth. There were evenings when Emma, despite the lingering scars of betrayal, found herself softening as Leo recounted small anecdotes from his own troubled past, tales of regret, of lessons learned too late. In those whispered stories, she sensed the beginnings of a man who was not perfect, but who was earnestly striving to be better. His efforts were small, almost imperceptible: a cup of hot tea left on the bedside table, a carefully chosen bouquet of wildflowers from a nearby park, a shared glance that spoke of mutual acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. For Emma, the journey was not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it, to allow it to inform a future that was still very much in the making. In the quiet hours, when the hospital corridors were empty and the weight of memories seemed too heavy to bear, she would press her hand gently over her growing belly and feel the reassuring flutter of life within. It was a silent promise that no matter how much they had lost, there was still a chance for new beginnings. As days turned into weeks, the fragile bridge between them, constructed of shared moments and tentative conversations, grew ever so slightly sturdier. Emma's walls, built high to keep out the pain, began to show cracks through which hope seeped in. Though the past was ever present, the future, as uncertain as it was, also beckoned with the promise of change. In the quiet communion of those shared dinners, Leo and Emma found themselves straddling the delicate line between forgiveness and the need to protect what was yet to be built, a future not defined solely by their past mistakes, but by the possibility of redemption. It was on a chilly winter morning, when the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pastels, that Emma's world shifted once more. The hospital room was alive with a frantic energy, nurses bustling, machines beeping in measured urgency, and the palpable anticipation that heralded the birth of new life. In the midst of this orchestrated chaos, Emma felt a sudden piercing pain that left her gasping for breath. Her eyes widened in alarm as she clutched the sides of the bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, a fragile hope that perhaps this pain was the prelude to something transformative. Leo, who had become a constant yet tentative presence in her life, was immediately by her side. His arms encircled her in a desperate attempt to offer comfort, his eyes mirroring the intense vulnerability of a man who had long carried the burden of regret. "It's too early," Emma whispered between labored breaths, a tremor in her voice that spoke of both pain and longing. In the sterile light of the delivery room, time seemed to contract and expand all at once, every second heavy with the promise of both loss and renewal. As the minutes stretched into an eternity, the sounds of the delivery, the quiet encouragements from the medical staff, the steady rhythm of Emma's labored breathing, the soft murmurs of reassurance, melded into a single, powerful symphony of hope. Then, amid the tension and the overwhelming rush of emotion, a small, piercing cry broke through the din. In that instant, the room was flooded with a sense of relief and awe. Tears mingled with sweat on Emma's face as she looked upon the tiny, fragile being that had arrived into the world, a living testament to both the beauty and the brutality of life. Leo's face, normally so guarded, softened as he took in the sight of their child. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he murmured, his voice trembling with sincerity and the weight of every unspoken apology. "But I want to be here." His words, spoken in the midst of a profound vulnerability, resonated deeply within Emma's soul. For so long, she had built walls around herself, determined never to allow the ghosts of the past to dictate her future. Yet here, in this raw and unscripted moment of creation and renewal, the possibility of a new beginning shimmered into view. Emma's heart, still tender from the wounds of abandonment and betrayal, found itself caught in a quiet battle between old resentments and the promise of hope. As she reached out to gently grasp the tiny fingers of her newborn, a calm resolve began to replace the tumult of her emotions. "Then prove it," she whispered, her voice firm yet laced with a fragile hope of reconciliation. It was a challenge, a silent invitation for Leo to show, through every small everyday act, that his presence was not just a fleeting ghost of the past, but a promise for a future built on mutual support and genuine change. In that tender moment, as the room filled with a soft glow of morning light and the quiet sounds of new life, Emma allowed herself to imagine a future where love might be reborn from the ashes of pain. The journey ahead would be long, fraught with challenges and memories that would not easily fade, but with each tiny heartbeat and every tentative smile exchanged between them, the foundation for a new chapter was laid. Here in the fragile intersection of heartbreak and hope, Emma and Leo embarked on the uncertain path toward redemption, a path illuminated by the gentle promise of tomorrow, and the undeniable truth that every ending, however painful, is also the seed of a new beginning. In the end, Emma's journey reminds us that every ending holds the seed of a new beginning. Though scars of the past may never entirely fade, they pave the way for healing and the promise of redemption. Through hardship, loss, and the bittersweet reunion with Leo, Emma discovers the resilient strength within herself and the hope that even shattered dreams can be rebuilt. This story is not just about the pain of letting go, but also about the courage to embrace change, to learn from every misstep, and to welcome a future filled with possibility. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and may its message of hope and renewal inspire you to find your own path toward healing. Thank you for watching the video until the end. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us.